Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julia Berg, she, her. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Foss Waterway Seaport, if you don't already know that by now. And I am so happy to be hosting our Lunchtime speaker series. So we'll start with a brief introduction to the Seaport, and then I am so excited to be bringing in Chuck Fowler today. So this is some drone footage from outside of the Seaport, and I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Foss Waterway Seaport acknowledges that our facility is specifically situated on the traditional homeland of the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Puyallup Tribe. So here is our gorgeous building. You can hear I'm in the city, so we got a siren going by. Our gorgeous building, 121 years old this year. And Chuck Fowler was one of the founding directors of the museum back before it was renovated, when it used to be called the Commencement Bay Maritime Center back in the early 90s, and then the Working Waterfront Museum in the early 2000s. And now, of course, we are called the Foss Waterway Seaport. Chuck has written a number of books, is an amazing historian. We are just so glad to have him join us today. All right, Chuck, I'm going to go ahead and bring you in. And here we are with Chuck Fowler. Good afternoon, Chuck.
How are you? Great to be here.
I am excellent. All right, so Chuck has a great presentation for us today. Is there anything you want to say before we bring that up, Chuck?
I don't think so. I'm a Tacoma boy, and so many of the photographs and images you'll see are Tacoma focused. So I think it'll be a familiar scene, and I hope it'll be an extremely interesting presentation.
I'm very excited. All right, so Chuck, if you want to go ahead and get your presentation up. While he's doing that, so today we're going to be learning about the book Tall Ships on Puget Sound, which is one of the ones that he's written. And he did that very quickly. All right, Chuck, look at that. Okay, so it looks like you are ready to go. Everyone can see and hear you, and your presentation is up. So let's go ahead and get this show on the road. Thank you, Chuck.
Great, thanks. Good to be here. Well, this book was published in 2007. And after I left the Seaport, I had a consulting firm and did consulting for some maritime museums and historic ships. But I got back to learning about the history, and got totally immersed in the maritime history of Tacoma, Puget Sound, the Pacific Northwest. And so I decided to do the book. It took me about 1.5 years to do the research and to write and work with a publisher to get it put out. But it was a labor of love, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share it with you today. And I just went too far and hit the icon too quickly, but the contents of Tall Ships on Puget Sound goes from the beginning. And the beginning, of course, is, as Julia said, from time immemorial, when the original indigenous native residents of Tacoma and Puget Sound and Pacific Northwest sailed the area in their native canoes. Now, when I say sails, they were the original sailors, and I'll talk a little bit about that beginning with the Native Americans before the arrival of tall ships and first contact and the early explorers. Then after that, I talk about from exploration to expansion. We go from 1850 to 1893, then transition and evolution. This was when we were transitioning from tall sailing ships to steamships. We'll go through that evolution. And then I like to take a chapter. I took a chapter and personalized it a little. We had in our family, my cousin's father was a German immigrant. He sailed, he was a sailor, tall ship, square rigged sailor, and he sailed around the world 6 times. But interestingly enough, he ended up in Tacoma, spent the rest of his life in Tacoma. And so I found some pictures that will tell about his story aboard the tall ships. And then the end of a proud era, when the sailing ships left the scene and the steam and power vessels took over. And that ended in about 1950, the last of the sailing ships in Puget Sound and the Northwest in the 50s. And then we had a new age of sail, and that was when various non-profit groups, both heritage groups and education groups, came back and had sailing ships. They bought sailing ships, they got sailing ships, and they used them for education on the Sound, education under sail. And we'll talk a little about that from 1951 to 2005. Actually, it continues on today. These were the first sailing ships, and as you'll see, they are native Salish canoes, and they do have sails. The picture on the left is of a macaw sailing canoe, and in the background you'll see a tall ship, and then you see the line of smoke. What's that all about? Well, the smoke is from a tugboat, and the tugboat is towing the tall ship you see behind the canoe in the center there. The only way that you could get enough wind for a major sailing ship loaded with cargo would be to take it out of the Sound and bring it out to Nia Bay, where it could catch the wind and sail then throughout the world. But tugboats had to tow vessels in and out of the Sound. But this is a sailing canoe, a Nootka design canoe with sails from the late 1800s, the photo on the right. And through trading with the European Americans, the sails in the beginning were woven cedar or thin cedar slabs that were used. Then when first contact came along, the sails became available, canvas became available, and the natives changed to fore and aft rigged sails for their canoes. Now, first contact came in 1792 when British Navy Captain George Vancouver came to Puget Sound with his two vessels, the Discovery and Chatham. And the scenes on the right are from artists of the time, contemporary artists, who depicted the only way, of course, they could depict Puget Sound, and there's Mount Rainier in the background, and then estuary with two of the sailing ships anchored out, was through the artists that they had on board. But they had to thoroughly document their expeditions and explorations, and so that's how they chronicled that. Then in 1836, the Hudson Bay Company came to Puget Sound. Of course, they had their operations in Victoria and Vancouver, British trading company, and they brought the first steamship to the Pacific Northwest, and that was a steamship Beaver, which you see here, a side wheeler. You see that it also has masts, and you ask, well, why are those sailing masts there if it had steam power? Well, the way that they got Beaver around the Horn to the Northwest is they sailed it from England to our area. But it was the first steamship in Puget Sound, and of course it connected the forts and trading posts in Vancouver and Victoria with the trading posts here in Puget Sound, most notably Fort Nisqually. And so that was in the 1880s. Then in 1841, from our side, from the United States explorations activities, Navy Lieutenant Charles Wilkes had the United States Exploring Expedition to Puget Sound in 1841. Wilkes was authorized by Congress to do a major exploration, so he also explored, as you can see on the right, Antarctica and the South Seas and Hawaii before he came to the Northwest to explore in 1841. But he had 7 ships, and the one on the right there, is the Vincennes. That was his flagship. But he had 6 other ships of various sizes that came to Puget Sound and did extensive, not only exploration of the waters of Puget Sound, but he sent inland parties overland as well to explore the shoreside areas. This is a favorite painting of mine because it shows both Nootka-style canoes on the shore and then a tall ship on the waterfront. and the Seattle waterfront in the 1880s. There were various encounters between natives and Euro-Americans, and it was important at this stage that we recognize those, as Julia did at the opening of this program, the cross-cultural activities, and we'll talk a lot more about that as we continue on with the program. This is an interesting shot because it shows just about where the Foss Waterway Seaport is today. That's Browns Point off in the background on the upper right. And then in the middle, there is Maury Island and Vashon Island to the left, and right off to the left by the top of the tall ship mast is the Quartermaster Harbor. And that's where my grandfather, who was a contractor in Tacoma in the late 1800s and early 1900s, built a beach home. And that's where I grew up and did my boating and swimming and got my first glimpse and love of maritime history. But this photograph, I wanted to include it because it shows the square rig sailing ships on the left, but you're previewing the arrival of steam, and you have your steam side wheeler on the right. Well, this is the Tacoma waterfront in 1886, 3 years before we became a state. We were still at Washington Territory at this time. And then these are some interesting scenes of Tacoma. The one at the top was actually in 1889, we became a state. It's from a promotional booklet, and you see the area down by the Tacoma Dome in the foreground, and then you see again off in the background Quartermaster Harbor, and then the downtown area where the Foss Waterway Seaport and the other buildings are now. And then you have this interesting postcard photo of square rigged ships being loading wheat at the warehouses on the city waterway, which is now the Foss Waterway. That's a photo postcard from the early 1900s, and that's part of the so-called mile-long warehouses, of which Foss Waterway Seaport, the Balfour Guthrie warehouse is one of those, one of the two survivors. But this is the rails to sails concept, where the grain and other commodities were brought over the mountains via train. The Northern Pacific Railway then built these warehouses, and that's how the grain was stored, offloaded onto the ships, and sent throughout the world. This is a full-rigged ship, the Lucille, and they are, as you can see, it's a tremendous amount of passengers on the vessel bound for the Alaska Gold Rush in 1898. So a big part of the sailing activities from the Sound were related in the late 1890s to the Alaskan Gold Rush. Unfortunately, many ships were brought from the East Coast. They weren't always in the best condition, but fortunately or unfortunately, the passengers who were trying to strike it rich in Alaska didn't know about the condition of those ships, but we didn't have any major problems. But I think had the passengers known about how frail some of those ships and how bad shape some of them were, they would have had second thoughts about getting to Alaska to find their fortune. This is a wonderful photograph that I found and included in the book. It's of Old Town, but it's taken from the water. I don't think we didn't have any drone photography at the time, but this was taken from another vessel. But it shows ships being loaded at the Tacoma Mill Company wharf in 1902. So you can see the very active mill in the background, and you have about 6 schooners off from the left to the right center, and then you've got one square-rigged ship off to the right, also loading lumber. The schooners tended to run in the coastwise trade, so they go from Tacoma to San Francisco and Los Angeles. They were very active in the rebuilding of San Francisco after the earthquake. But the square rig ships loaded lumber that would be sent through to Australia and Japan and also to Europe. Now this is photograph of very familiar background scene. There's the old Tacoma courthouse in the background, and then the mile-long series of warehouses. The Foss Waterway Seaport building, the Balfour Guthrie Dock, is off to the right. But in the foreground is the Queen Margaret, and that's a wonderful full-rigged ship. It is full square sails on all three masts, and then you have a fourth mast. But this is called a bark, B-A-R-Q-U-E or B-A-R-K, and that relates to the rigging that you see on the vessel. But this was the vessel that my relative, my cousin's father, came to Tacoma on in 1901. And we'll tell you the full story of this ship and my cousin's father, who was Wilhelm Koenig. And we'll let you see what it's like to sail on a tall ship in this period. Now, the reason why I found these photographs is that my cousin lived in, he was an engineer, and later he became part of Buckley King Funeral Directors. But when he first came to Tacoma in 1901, this is the crew on the upper left aboard the Queen Margaret. And he is the gentleman in the black hat in the back row with the mustache. Of course, all of these people, all of these crew members were dressed up for these photos, which were taken by Wilhelm Hester. Wilhelm Hester was a Seattle photographer, and among his activities, he went aboard the tall ships, took pictures of the crew, took pictures of the ships, and then sold them back to the crew members who wanted memories of their visit to Seattle and the fact they were on these ships to send back to their relatives in Europe and wherever they had come from. But then, as I was doing research, I found the photographs, and one of which is on the right, and the other one is at lower left. This is Fred Taylor, and Fred Taylor was a student at Williams College in Massachusetts. His father was a shipbroker. In other words, he got ships that would send cargo throughout the world. And Fred, during one summer, said to his father, we're coming to the end of the age of square rig sailing, and I'd like to have you put me during the summer on a tall ship. I was sailing out of New York around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa to Australia. And so he did that, and he took with him the first of the Kodak Brownie box cameras and roll film. That was the era of roll film. And he photo documented his trip fully during the entire time. But he took some photographs that then allowed me to depict what it was like for my relative, W.A. Koenig, to sail on that very ship, the Queen Margaret, same one that Fred Taylor had sailed on many years later as a much younger man. The upper left picture is the Queen Margaret. That's the only picture we have it under full sail. And you can see the square rigs and then the 4.5 rig sail at on the stern. But unfortunately, on the lower left, this is what happened to the Queen Margaret in 1913, wrecked off the southeast coast of England. What the ships would do, they were loaded down with cargo, grain or lumber or whatever. They would go to the southeast corner of Cornwall in England, and they'd get a signal from the shore by flag that where they would dock. They would get signal from the broker as to where they would dock and unload their cargo in London. Unfortunately, Queen Margaret's captain came too close to shore, foundered, and they lost the ship. All the crew was saved, but the ship and the cargo itself were lost. Now, this is my cousin Bill. He's passed on now, but this was with his father's painting of his beloved bark, Queen Margaret, and this is a picture I took of Bill in 2007. Now, he'd had that original photo of his father as a crew member in his study, and I remembered seeing that when I would come home and visit him when I was going to college. So all those years later, I said, Bill, tell me the story about your photo of your dad and then his story. Unfortunately, his dad didn't have any photos of himself aboard Queen Margaret, but luckily through Fred Taylor's photo documentation, I was able to show what it was like for Bill's dad to sail aboard the Queen Margaret, one of his 6 round the world voyages on tall ships. Back to Pacific Northwest, this photograph at the top left is of ships being ready for launch at the Hall Brothers shipyard in Port Blakely in 1902. So this was about the same period that the Queen Margaret was at the dock on the what is now the Foss Waterway Seaport. And then at the right, you had the British bark Linton hauled for repair at the Eagle Harbor, their Eagle Harbor yard. They had a yard at Port Blakely and they had a yard at Eagle Harbor. So the Hall brothers were very famous shipbuilders. They built lumber schooners of wood on the right, and then they serviced steel ships, barks, and others at their Eagle Harbor yard on Bainbridge Island. This was an intriguing photograph I found because it showed in a schooner off to the right, a sail-rigged steamer, which is probably a Coast Guard cutter, and a submarine in Port Townsend in 1912. Now, you would think we would have submarines in 1912, but we did have submarines being built in Seattle at one of the yards there. And so this was a wonderful shot showing the evolution of vessels and in operation on Puget Sound. And you even had a little steamer off to the left coming into view. But the sailing schooners were the most common vessel in Puget Sound. And here you see the Wawona, which was a exhibit vessel at Northwest Seaport in Seattle for many, many years until it was its condition just deteriorated. It couldn't be saved, and so it had to be scrapped. But this was a Wawona in its heyday when it was a cod fishing schooner in the 1940s. And those strips you see on the dock, that is codfish being dried on the dock. But the picture here is shown in 1915 at the Robinson Fisheries Dock in Anacortes. The photograph at the right shows the Pacific Packing and Navigation Fleet in layup at Pleasant Cove on Chuckanut Bay up by Bellingham. Company went bankrupt in 1903 after, as it says here, overextending its Alaska canning and fleet operations. So it was the fisheries in Alaska was going great guns, and then all of a sudden that whole thing stopped, and the schooners and the vessels that were involved with that fishing fleet, both the schooners and the square-rigged ships, became unusable and surplus, and so these companies went bankrupt. Then in 1918, during the World War I period, we had another rush of shipbuilding. Again, here we have some auxiliary schooners, as they were called. The one on the right is 5-masted, but you can see it also has steam power. It has steam coming out of the stacks, and that's why it was called an auxiliary schooner. It had an auxiliary engine. So when it couldn't be powered and wasn't economically good to be powered by steam in order to make their schedules and all, they had steam power as well. The two pictures on the left were of the shipbuilding in Olympia during the 1917 to 18 period. The German submarines were taking out and sinking so many of our ships that were carrying cargo necessary for the war effort to Europe from the United States that there was an emergency shipbuilding plan. So many wooden ships were built during this time. Unfortunately, many of them had problems with their steam engines. Many of them were built too late for the war, and they never got into the war. So I'll show you what happened to some of them, or most of them. These were obsolete World War I ships burned for their scrap metal value in Minter Creek over on on the Key Peninsula in 1926. There just was no business, no cargo business for these many, many ships, more than 250 that were built as an emergency shipbuilding program during World War I. So unfortunately, they just had to be burned, and the only value was the scrap metal that they salvaged. And then we had, this was a picture in Lake Union in 1929, and these ships were laid up again. Not enough business for too many square-rigged ships. And of course, steam and the large cargo vessel ships like you see on the left had taken over by this time. And the square riggers were just obsolete and surplus. This is the last of the major square rig ships leaving Lake Union just before the completion of the Aurora Bridge in late 1931. But it just shows the end of an era as car and truck transportation took over, and the square rig ships were on their way out. Now, this is a photograph which many of you on the Seaport will be familiar with. This is the USS Constitution when it visited Tacoma and many other cities in Puget Sound in 1933. And you can see the crowds there. Off to the left is the dock building, still standing, and there's the open parking lot between the dock building and the Foss Waterway Seaport, which you can't see on the right, but you can see the crowds of people that were going aboard the Constitution. Constitution was taking a around the nation tour, being towed by the Navy tugboat Grebe, and this was a picture of it with Mount Rainier in the background in 1933. But school children contributed their pennies to allow the restoration of the Constitution, and the Constitution has been restored several times in its career, and it's just an icon, of course, of our American maritime history. But this is the period when I was telling you about the return of the tall ships. Here you have the schooner Adventurous, which visits Tacoma and many ports in Puget Sound. It's owned by Sound Experience, an environmental education organization. And then here you see it in 1989 together with the Lady Washington, and the Lady Washington was on its maiden voyage to Puget Sound in 1989 when it was launched during the centennial. We also had other living history events. This was the Washington State Heritage Flotilla in 1986 and 87. We put together, I was involved in putting together a fleet of 16 ships, which went to Expo 86 in Vancouver. We had reenactors who were dressed up as members of the Wilkes expedition in 86. And the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. had a traveling exhibition about the Wilkes voyage, and many of the artifacts that are in the Smithsonian Institution, the original artifacts, came from those collected by the Wilkes expedition in 1841. So we had an event which commemorated this and helped people learn about the history, this part of the maritime history of Washington State. This was a Lady Washington approaching Tacoma with a longboat. This is a ship's boat. And in 2001, and then the Indian canoe from the Chinook tribe on the Columbia River left the Hawaiian Chieftain, which is the companion ship to the Lady Washington, operated by the Grace Harbor Historic Seaport. The picture on the right happened in 2005. But over the years, we've had many cross-cultural activities. We brought the native indigenous Salish people together with we European Americans and our tall ships. And we've had a lot of reconciliation and healing activities which have attempted to heal some of the conflicts of the original expeditions and first contact expeditions 200 years ago. We have also had tall ships activities. This is the Bark Europa in the center, entering Lake Union for the Seattle Tall Ships event in 2002, and the ship to the left is the schooner Zodiac, a sister vessel to the Adventurous. Then in 2005, Tacoma had a major tall ships event, and of course, ships from foreign nations were invited. This was a production of the American Sail Training Association, which is now called Tall Ships America, and it is the organization of tall ships, sailing ships in the United States and Canada. And through their Pacific Tall Ship Challenge, Tacoma and Vancouver and Victoria were part of the tall ships visits in 2005. So this is the Russian tall ship Pallada, and then we had the Thompson from Australia in the foreground picture on the upper left. But this was a major event. By the way, the Russian ship was built in 1989. The Russian nation built a whole series of about 6 new tall ships for sail training activities in Russia and some of the satellite countries. This was a Tall Ships Tacoma, an old town on the Theophos Waterway in 2005. Brought the tall ships back, and it was a wonderful, wonderful event because it harkened back to the days of the sailing ships and when those ships called at the Foss Waterway Seaport and the dock building during the rails to sails period in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So we were able to tell that kind of tall ship story once again, with history repeating itself on the waterway. And of course, in 2008, we had another event where we went to our congressional delegation and said, boy, it would sure be nice if the Coast Guard training ship Eagle, which is headquartered in Connecticut, would visit the West Coast as part of our tall ships event for 2008. It took a lot of arm twisting, but luckily our congressional delegation, both the senators and the representatives, arm twisted Nancy Pelosi at the time, and she wanted the ships to visit San Francisco and Los Angeles, and so we got the Eagle to come to Tacoma, and it was a truly wonderful event, which we had in the 4th of July period. Well, this has been a very quick trip through tall ships on Puget Sound, from the earliest canoes with sails to the tall ships of today. But I've been involved as a consultant, as an author, and a historian in this story, and it's been a terrific adventure. And a terrific voyage. So thanks for listening. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I guess if Julia can come back in, we've got time for a few questions.
Thank you so much, Chuck. That was really interesting. And so if you have some questions, go ahead and post those in the chat, and Chuck will answer those. Chuck, if you want to go ahead and exit your presentation and come back on over to StreamYard so you can see those questions. So while he's doing that, just a few housekeeping things. Next month, same time, we will have a presentation from Megan Churchwell, who's a curator at the Puget Sound Naval Museum, on Beyond Rosie the Riveter, the history of women in the Navy. So if that's something you're interested in, you can tune into that in an early first Tuesday in April. And I also wanted to show that we still have for sale, if you came to one of our previous lunchtime programs, these beautiful hanging lanterns in the Seaport. So these are $200. They're part of the Ghosts of the Salish Sea exhibit. And those are going to be for sale until April 1st. A small portion of the sales does go to support the Seaport. So they are absolutely gorgeous. If you haven't had a chance to see them in person, we're part of the Tacoma Light Trail. All right, and Chuck is back. Hello, Chuck.
How are you?
Okay, let's see. So we have a thank you from Colleen. Thank you so much. And I also wanted to ask Chuck, so it sounds like you know quite a bit about the tall ships. You probably don't know this about me, but I actually used to be the captain of a topsail ketch, which is quite a weird rig with several square rigs. And it was originally the Lady Washington, the captain who started that boat. It was his private yacht that he lived on for years with his wife. But anyways, so.
And you're talking about Les Bolton.
No.
No.
Before him.
Before him.
Way back in the day.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you could tell people, if they want to get involved in sailing tall ships, people are starting out, what are the local opportunities?
Well, I think if you're, whether you're a young person or older person like myself, I think by contacting the ships themselves, Sound Experience with Adventurous, and the director there is Catherine Collins, and then Schooner Zodiac in Bellingham with Tim Mayer. They are always looking for, it's more of a program for seniors, but the Schooner Zodiac is available to go aboard, and you can volunteer. They will teach you how to sail tall ships and all of that. And of course, the Grays Harbor Historic Seaport with the Lady Washington and the Hawaiian Chieftain are always looking for individuals to volunteer. So there's lots of opportunities. There's small vessel sailing opportunities through the Center for Wooden Boats in Seattle, from the Wooden Boat Foundation in Port Townsend. And so there's all kinds of opportunities to get involved, and it's just a fascinating adventure.
Right. And you don't necessarily have to have any experience, right? I know the Lady Washington, I'm not sure their schedule. I just checked, and we don't have them. A lot of times, of course, we have them at our docks in the summer. They haven't announced their schedule yet. We have a question from Nancy Davis. Are there any tall ship events planned for the West Coast in the next few years? Do you have any intel on that?
Well, I used to be on the board of the American Sail Training Association, and then I was on the advisory board. The Pacific Coast Tall Ship Challenge events were very economically challenging, let's say. And so they haven't had those since 2008. They have them in the East Coast and the Great Lakes, but not coming back to the West Coast. We have very large distances between ports here on the West Coast, and so it's very difficult and very costly to have the ships involved in these activities. So I'm not aware of any major events that are scheduled, but I would think the communities would be interested in putting something together. I think that's especially true because the Washington State has just been designated by the National Park Service as the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. And so that is a designation which is very well coveted in the United States under the Park Service. There are 55 heritage areas in the United States, and only about 4 on the entire West Coast. Mainly it's an East Coast activity. But we applied more than 10 years ago to become a heritage area, and with a maritime theme. So now we are the only heritage area in the United States with a specific maritime theme. So under the organization of the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, that whole heritage area organization and all the featured activities involved in it, and then the sites like the Foss Waterway Seaport will be included. The management plan is being put together now. So by 2022, you'll see the development and signage and online websites and all about that activity. That will bring about $500,000 in federal funds, which have to be matched locally. But that will start to allow us to do some things and to develop economic and tourism development in the region. So that's a long way around, but that could provide some funding to start a new tall ships program and a tall ships events in the Pacific Northwest. So that's a good possibility for the future.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I know, even coming from a modern sailing background, being on a tall ship, there's really just nothing like it. I remember I always knew how to tie a cleat knot this way, but when I transitioned to the tall ships, I had to learn what a pin was, and it just goes the other way. And it
Yeah.
really is such an interesting experience if you're able to get that. Here we have something from Bill Evans. Great to see you after so many years. Great to hear you speak. Wondering about that ship that is in the room you are speaking from. Can you tell us about that? They're looking at your background.
Well, is that Bill Evans?
It is. Yeah, that's what it says.
Bill Evans of the Pacific Northwest shop. That ship is the Cuauhtémoc, which was the national ship of Mexico, which was in Tacoma in 2005 at our Tall Ships Tacoma 2005 event. It was moored at the what is now the Foss Waterway Seaport moorage. And thank you for asking, Bill, but that happens to be a painting of Cuauhtémoc by my wife, Carla. And Carla's a marine artist, and she has done quite a few paintings of tall ships and tugboats through the years. But that's one that I particularly like, so I have it in my office.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Wow. Okay, this was a question that came through. Speaking of art, how can you see the lanterns in person?
That's you.
Yeah, and so those were supposed to have been taken down, but they are still up. So if you come down to the Seaport tonight, you can look through the windows and they're all lit up. It's best to see them in the evening as part of the Tacoma Light Trail. So they are still up and displayed in front of our big glass north wall there. And another question here. Thanks. Good info from Nancy Davis. Do you know if there are any educational sailings planned in the Pacific Northwest in a couple of years that you know of? The main one, like he had mentioned before, the Lady Washington and the Zodiac. I don't know if anyone's announced their schedules yet for the summer, just like us. Do you have anything to add to that, Chuck?
No, I think they're really struggling. They're trying to figure out under the governor's guidelines, how many people can get together and how they have to do the social distancing. As Julia knows, when you're hauling lines on board a tall ship, you're very close together and close proximity. So you're going to have to be very careful. Luckily, I'm of an age that I've had my second COVID shot now, and I'm feeling a little more free. But we're going to have to get to herd immunity before we can go tall ship sailing again. But I think if you watch the organizations that we just talked about and their websites, they will be able to tell you when they're gearing up and when they really feel comfortable coming together and offering opportunities for both youth sailors and also for seniors like me.
Yeah, and I was thinking about something. I was looking through the collections the other day, and I found a picture from 1918. Speaking of the pandemic, and it was in the shipyard. And it turns out, they had vaccinated the shipyard members. But when you were talking about, the sailing vessels, do you know? I never hear anyone talk about how did the 1918 pandemic affect these crews on the sailing ships. I mean, I always had a quarantine flag, whenever even now, before the pandemic, when you went into a port, before you clear customs, you're required to fly a yellow quarantine flag, which of course was really more of a carryover, I think, from previous pandemics. But now that that's on everybody's mind, do you have any insight into the history of how the 1918 pandemic affected the tall ship sailing?
I don't. The only kind of connection, as I mentioned, during the First World War, of course, that was 1917, 1914, 1917, 18. They were building ships in the shipyard rather than probably just, I think the flu pandemic was just at the end of that, the outbreak. I haven't done any research on that particular subject, so I'm sorry I don't have any information.
Yeah, I don't think there really probably hasn't been looked into it very heavily, but I bet you someone's going to write a book on that pretty soon. It'll be pretty interesting.
I think so, and someone will probably write a book on the history of what we've just gone through too.
Absolutely. Anyways, I don't see any other questions coming in at the moment. So if you are watching this program recorded, you can type questions in the comments here. We do still monitor those. And this is a good question. What does a pandemic flag look like, and when was it flown? You want to take that one, Chuck?
Well, I don't know that one. You're
okay. So when you see ships, any ship come into the harbor, you're familiar with all the signal flags, right? And we have a whole set of them inside the seaport, and each one represents a letter of the alphabet. So there's one that's solid yellow, and it's the Q, or the quarantine flag. So even now, when you're on a modern sailboat and you're sailing between countries, just like when you're at the airport and you come in, you have to wait to clear customs, but they don't know, a ship appears in the night. You're required to fly, in most places, a Q flag and then also the flag of that country, and then go to the designated customs area. So when you're flying that Q, or solid yellow quarantine flag, it means that you haven't cleared customs yet. And, every country has different rules. But yeah, so that's something that's still in practice today. It's very illegal, just like it would be to walk across any border, to come in on a boat without properly going through customs, and usually involves displaying that flag.
Yeah, there's a wonderful Willem Hester photograph of tall ships in Commencement Bay, anchored out. And then in the foreground, you see this big ship's boat with about 6 crewmen rowing one of the doctors from the health department out to the vessel to check. They quarantine the ships in the Commencement Bay until they're cleared by the medical examiner for disembarking and unloading their cargo.
Yeah. Yep. It's always sickness and ships. We did a whole talk about it about a year ago, I think. That's on our YouTube with Jordan Hansen. He was mostly talking about scurvy, but yeah, illness and sailing have always been closely related. You get sick at sea, there's nowhere to go. Anyway.
As we were saying, when you're aboard a ship, you're very close contact, close proximity. So you have to be very concerned about all kinds of health problems and outbreaks. Absolutely.
But, we're hoping that someone asked about when we're reopening. I put it in the comments. We're hoping to, speaking of outbreaks, hoping to be reopening to the public fully in early June. We do have some other things going before then. But I also want to draw your attention to our live Third Thursday program this month, which is going to be on the SS Governor with Robert Messer again. So he owns the salvage rights to that ship, which sunk up off of Port Townsend. And it's a treasure ship full of treasure. There's a safe, and it's going to be a really fun Third Thursday. So don't miss that one. Those usually start at 8 o'clock at night on the third Thursday with our partner, Pretty Gritty Tours. So thank you, everybody, so much for joining us for your lunch hour. And if you're watching the recording again, please feel free to write your comments or send us an email. And thank you so much, Chuck. It's really been an honor. I really appreciate your time. And we will see you all next month. See you soon.
Really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.